And a very pleasant good evening to everyone. It is Sunday, May 27th, 2018. It's just after 9 p.m. And it is the Connoisseurs of Wrestling podcast, the show where we talk about all things wrestling, just a treasure trove of wrestling knowledge, history, dropping some interesting facts your way. It's going to be a great episode today, guys. I want to take a moment first, though, to wish everyone a very happy Memorial Day weekend. Of course, this is uh, time for remembrance in this country. If you know a veteran, be sure to thank them too, and remember those that didn't get a chance to come home. Just an important time to just kind of pay respect, kind of pay reverence to all the people that have given us the freedom that we have to do this type of show here. So it's a good time of the year just to kind of pay thanks. And we're thankful for a lot of stuff here today. If you're a sports fan, you've had quite a time of it. A lot of racing action today, a lot of basketball and hockey going on. But we're going to be talking about some classic wrestling. We're going to continue on with our discussion of the late, great Bruno Sammartino. We started that a few weeks ago. We're going to talk about his later career today. And of course, no show is complete without his hosts. First, want to introduce the curator of the Connoisseurs, our official show's historian, the incomparable, let me try that again, the incomparable Legends Lover. LL, how are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing pretty good tonight. Hi, everybody.
We've got LL in the house here, going to be talking about some Bruno Sammartino matches. And of course, we also have the godfather of podcasting associated with the Cage Side Seats family of shows. My friend, the one, the only, the great one, Taker's Minion. Taker, my friend, good to see you, buddy.
Yeah, it's good to have you back. Hello, everyone. Good evening. It's good to have you back from the world of not feeling well, Mr. Biff.
Yeah, I felt like I went through a car wreck the last couple of weeks, but hopefully I'm on the mend here. Special thank you to Doc Sinju for filling in last week. On short notice to boot. So
Yeah.
thank you to him. We're going to be talking about some really awesome stuff. And Taker, we talked a little bit about this a couple of weeks ago. We kind of set the table on Bruno Sammartino. And, where we left off, we kind of covered the first part of his career. We talked about some of the highlights. We addressed the Bob Backlund, the Larry Zbyszko matches. We talked about his title reigns, kind of how he got his start in the business, a little bit of personal information. But, I think the way his career ended in the WWF is almost as interesting as the highlights of his championship runs. And so we're going to be talking a little bit about that here today. But first, I really got to ask you and LL a couple of questions. We've been kind of talking more about the territories on the show so far. We started off with the Jumping Bomb Angels in the WWF, but then we kind of morphed into the AWA. We really focused a lot on the Midwestern territories over the last couple of weeks. When did you, Taker, first kind of get into the WWF? Was it in the late 70s, or was it not until kind of Vince McMahon started his national expansion in the 80s? When did you first get exposed to wrestling from New York?
Basically, it was when he started his national expansion. I had moved to California, and I gotten involved with the wrestling at the what was known as the Grand Olympic Auditorium. It was called the Olympic Auditorium back then. It was a boxing and wrestling venue downtown Los Angeles. It had many metamorphoses in its life. It started out as like I said, the Olympic Auditorium, and then it was closed and then reopened as the Grand Olympic when MGM Grand bought it. But I digress with that. It was, you would see a lot of the Spanish wrestling from there, a lot of lucha, but it was NWA related and WWF related because they were having Bob Backlund come in and defend his title there, and that's when I started watching more. It was all in Spanish, so You didn't understand the commentary that much, but it was still good wrestling to watch. That's where you saw the Guerreros, El Hijo de Santo, all of them,
There's a name from the past. Wow.
But I could, like I said, I'm at times a veritable treasure trove of names.
Well, something, we've been talking so much about the territories the last couple of weeks, and I really wanted to kind of highlight some of the differences between what the WWF was offering, especially in the 1980s, compared to what you might have been accustomed to with the AWA or, Dick the Bruiser's promotion out of Indianapolis. There was a discernible difference in the style of wrestling, and not just when Vince Jr. took over, but there was kind of always a different style that kind of dominated the Northeast. And it's important to our discussion of Bruno, considering how he left the company. Can you kind of give us a little bit of a feel of how the WWF television kind of differed from what you were used to with your wrestling programming?
Well, myself, when I would watch, it was the crowds were bigger. That's one thing I could see when I was watching, because I started watching it on Saturdays. I think it was All Star Wrestling then. I'm not sure what it was called. It was like an hour show of tape that was, shipped out. And nobody knew that Vince Jr. at the time had already gotten the company. And it was all on tape. And you would have Vince, and I think it was Roddy. I can't remember who was his color person with him at the time. That's been so long ago. And I would notice it was always larger crowds. Whereas when I was watching the AWA on television as a kid, it was a studio show. So you would have like 30 to 40 people there if you were lucky in a studio. Whereas we were seeing actual taped events from, I guess the bigger house shows that they were doing. And
they would do shows at places. Allentown, Pennsylvania was a common stop where they would film TV. Of course, Rochester, New York, they would do some shows from there. If I'm not mistaken, it was actually Rochester where Miss Elizabeth debuted for the Macho Man Randy Savage. We'll be talking a little bit about him later. We also had the Hulk Hogan, Paul Orndorff angle took place in Rochester, if I'm not mistaken. So, it was kind of interesting. A lot of the memorable angles from this particular era of programming actually did take place some of the smaller venues, but of course, by WWF standards or by the business standards, they were actually quite a lot bigger than the ordinary studios you would see from the AWA or from Georgia, Crockett, and things of that ilk.
That's true. I mean, and it was something I took a little, I kind of cocked my head and go, well, that's a big crowd. Where are they doing this at? And then they would say either Rochester, New York, or Allentown, or Philadelphia, at the old Civic Center when they used to run the shows there. And at this time, Vince was starting to tread into others' territories, which was back then was a big no-no. But the thing about it is that Vince and Jay, the father, had already broken away from the NWA at this time and went out on his own. So there was a group that broke away from the NWA. The only one that survived that was what is WWE today.
There's so much backstory to how Vince Jr. actually kind of took over from his father. There's some real seedy stuff in there, actually. Of course, Vince Sr. didn't live very long after Capital Sports, which was the original parent company of the WWF, now WWE, of course, was sold to Vince Jr. and his Titan Sports. If you ever hear Titan, of course, Titan is not exactly bandied about these days, but originally the WWF was owned by a parent company, Titan Sports. And so
It still is, as far as I'm aware.
I'm not sure if they still use the Titan name. I think they might have rebranded into just WWE.
Yeah, they could have.
But there's all sorts of subsidiaries that you could talk about. Of course, Coliseum Video. A lot of old farts like us, we remember Coliseum Video, and with the greatest entrances in the history of wrestling on some of those old Coliseum videotapes. It began 5,000 years ago, but with the moving Star Wars style crawl on the star background. If you've never seen it, you probably have no idea what the hell we're talking about. But trust us, it was awesome. There was so much seediness going on. How that all fell apart. Vince Senior's henchmen, if you could call them that, kind of jumping ship and going with Vince Jr. It was a hostile takeover, to be quite honest, and it really capped off what was a real tumultuous period in the business, not just in the Northeast, but you had so much going on in the AWA during this period, 1982, 83, into 84. You had the Hulk Hogan situation where he was about to jump ship and take a bunch of talent with him because Vern wasn't wanting to put the title on him. And there's also talk of the merchandise issue that might have come between them. You have, the world-class territory having kind of a break with Mid-South around this period. Some problems between Bill Watts and Fritz von Erich. You have the Georgia Championship Wrestling debacle where they got booted off the air in favor of WWF.
That was
Saturday. Just a ton of stuff going on, and it's all this craziness. And this is what Bruno Sammartino comes back into in 1985, right at the tail end of all of this turmoil. WWF is trying to go national here. We're coming up on the very first edition of WrestleMania. And so, can you give us a little bit of an indication, and LL, you can jump in here as well. How crazy was wrestling in the mid-'80s compared to what you had kind of grown up on? Because really in the mid-'80s, the landscape is really starting to be turned upside down, and it's really a crazy time in the business.
Well, I started watching WWF in the 80s. You had like Captain Lou Albano, Wendy Richter in that. And I mean, from what I was used to watching, it was nuts. It was more like they weren't sure what they were doing. It was more like games compared to what I was used to. They were fun, but it was, I don't know, completely different than what I was used to.
That's the same thing I was saying, is that it was different from what I had been watching because of just the sheer size of the crowds you would see on the television, on the video. And then I started noticing promotion in Los Angeles, because at the time in the 80s, I was living in California, living in Southern California, and I would see a promotion for Bob Backlund against Mil Mascaras, or Bob Backlund against one of the Guerreros, Chavo or Hondo or Gory, was always you'd always be going after. So it's like they got involved with the WWF, and that's when you started to see the actual, what Vince Jr. was up to. He would develop a partnership, and then he would just up and take it over.
Yeah, that's how it worked in Houston. And we talked a little bit last episode. We spoke on Bruno about how he had a brief run in Houston. One of the misnomers, I think, about the WWF over its history is that it was kind of isolated from the rest of the country, and that really wasn't true. You did see some transition, from some of the top stars kind of moving around. Of course, Bob Backlund mentioned a little bit a minute ago. He started out in Florida and came up north, but he would go and do shots down in Georgia. Of course, he had a memorable exchange with Ric Flair on Georgia Championship Wrestling, one of those title for title matches that was all the rage in this era. Bruno Sammartino had a couple of shots that he made in San Francisco for Roy Shire. He would also make the occasional shot in Los Angeles as well. Los Angeles used to be one of the biggest territories in the country.
Wasn't that Gene LaBelle?
I think it was. Gene LaBelle was kind of invested in that territory. Freddie Blassie was really kind of the biggest star to come out of Los Angeles in the original incarnation. Now, as the 80s and 90s kind of took on a new feel, Lucha Libre kind of came into Los Angeles, and they had another mini resurgence. The AAA promotion, When Worlds Collide, the pay-per-view in 1994, came from Los Angeles, the sports arena, if I'm not mistaken.
I believe you're correct.
So
what do you have to say, LL?
Well, there's something else I noticed about when I was just starting to get into the WWF. At that time, it was more, like we said, it was different. It was more entertainment than the regular wrestling we were used to. But they also were bringing in stars, music stars like Cyndi Lauper. They were mixing them up a lot. So you weren't sure if you were watching just wrestling or if you were watching entertainment or what. I think that's when a lot of people started seeing sports entertainment. Is when the WWF started going nationally. You've seen more, excuse me, you've seen more women, but the women were mostly like the valets and stuff like that. But you've seen a lot more women. They brought more of the sex appeal in with the WWF than what was in with the other wrestling alliances.
Well, and also during that time, Vince had created a partnership with, Moolah.
Yes.
And that is how the women's wrestling became such a staple of WWF. Is because Moolah had her own promotion with the women that was a traveling. She had her own women's promotion, but she didn't have a territory. So she went around the country to the different territories like a traveling circus.
Like a touring company, right?
Yeah, traveling circus, touring company. And she'd gotten into a partnership with Vince Jr. and actually made it work for many years. But the one drawback was that she was always the champion.
Yeah, and among other problems too, which probably best left unsaid for right now. But but see, this is a good point to kind of segue into tonight's topic, and that is, the changing landscape that Bruno Sammartino comes back into in 1985. We talked during the last episode about some of the backstage stuff that was going on, not only in his first appearance in the company in the early 60s, but also in the early 80s, and how Bruno had kind of some problems with different people in the company. He would have some major problems with Vince Jr., which we're going to talk about. But just between the time he retired in 1981, the first time, and when he comes back in 1985, the business was radically different. And that's kind of what we've been laying out the case here for. What wrestling was in 85 is not what wrestling was in 81.
No.
But Bruno comes back in 1985 as much for his son, I would argue, as anything. Bruno has a son, David Sammartino. If you've ever seen the first WrestleMania, David actually has a match with Brutus Beefcake. Now, this is before he became Brutus the Barber Beefcake.
Mm-hmm.
He was still with Johnny V, the late Johnny V.
Yep.
But Bruno comes back, and he's ostensibly trying to help get David into the WWF. And that kind of leads us into really what was Bruno's first big angle back, which was the Sammartino family against Johnny V and Brutus Beefcake. And Johnny V, of course, one part of the Valiant brothers, so he had some wrestling experience before he kind of became a manager. And this is the first angle back. And it's ironic in the sense that not only did it really fail to capture the imagination in the audience at the time, it actually kind of led to a split between Bruno and his son David. They were estranged for a really long time.
Yes, 5 years, I think.
Yeah, do you have anything to kind of add on that? Because this is a real dark chapter in Bruno's life that doesn't get talked about very much.
Well, one of the things when he returned, it was actually late 84 when Bruno came back. You know, that was part of the settlement agreement between the old Capital Wrestling Corporation and Bruno. It was over monies that were not paid to Bruno during his second title run. You know, because promised percentages of the gate was not paid to Bruno. It was settled out of court after Senior died, and the numbers were not disclosed, but it included an agreement that he would come back as a commentator, which was fine. Bruno didn't want to go in the ring anymore. You know, he'd had enough. He was hurt. He had abused his body at that point for close to 20 years, over 20 years. And he's like, I'm done. Don't want to do it no more. Well, over time, he helped get his son David into the WWF. And David was having issues of getting over, I guess. So they put Bruno in his corner. And eventually it worked its way to Bruno putting on the tights again. And that was the beginning of the estrangement. Beloved, Bruno was beloved by all. David was a lot of fans didn't take to David because he came from a different generation and a different lifestyle. Even though Bruno wasn't there, it was all about his family. And that's something that Bruno talks about, has talked about many times at length, that the reason he wrestled was for his family. He provided for his parents, and he provided for his wife and kids. But as you will find out, as you have heard more and more, being a professional wrestler and being married is very, very hard because you're never there. You'll be gone 3-4 weeks and then home for 3 days. And you try to do everything you've missed in 3 days to, catch up with your family. And just never, and Bruno's wife for a number of years, even until he finally retired, she wanted him off the road. She didn't want him doing that anymore. She didn't like it. She never liked it. But getting back to the estrangement, it's when Bruno got into the corner and put on the tights again. He cast such a huge shadow. David felt that his father was holding him down. And that's what started it. That's why David went down to WCCW. And Bruno told him, don't do it. And he did. He went down to WCCW as Bruno Sammartino Jr., got himself over, but also was taken advantage of by Fritz. And there was nothing Bruno could do for him. Plus, there was some drugs involved and painkillers involved, and that, too, was another reason that kind of shied Bruno away from him.
Yeah, and that's going to become a recurring theme with Bruno over the next couple of years of his WWF career in the 80s. There's just so much going on backstage. For a lot of people that came of age watching the WWF during the early years of Hulkamania, or those that were lucky enough to catch the programming, most of their memories of Bruno in this period were as an announcer. He was one of the co-hosts for several years with Jesse Ventura and Vince McMahon on the Superstars of Wrestling. Superstars of Wrestling used to be the WWF's flagship show. It was in the 80s and early 90s what Raw would be today. Bruno was one part of the commentary team. So if you thought, three-man boost was a recent invention of the WWF or WWE, it's been going on for quite a while.
Off and on for years.
Yeah, it's been a recurring theme with the company. And I'm not going to cast aspersions on Bruno, of course. If you ever listen to Bruno cut a promo, he does have a thick accent, but he was decent on commentary. He wasn't the greatest, but he was decent.
Well, he gave a wrestler's perspective.
Exactly. And that, I think, is kind of what highlights the dichotomy between Bruno's first run and his run in the 80s. He is still trying to give that classic wrestling perspective through commentary, but the business is changing so much that it's just hard to kind of almost keep pace with it. And that really kind of bleeds through in his commentary, where you could almost tell, especially by 86 and especially in 87, he's really kind of a third wheel in there. He doesn't really feel like he has a place. He's not quite capturing, what he's seeing play out in the ring like Jesse Ventura or Vince McMahon would. He never made the transition as successfully as Gorilla Monsoon did. And, that's going to kind of play into his exile from wrestling, his self-imposed exile, which we'll talk about at the end of the show. But, once you get past the David Sammartino issues with his family, Bruno actually becomes a semi-regular wrestler through the summer of 85 into 86 and even into some of 1987. And a lot of people at the time kind of looked on Bruno as being past his prime. Looking back now, there are some memorable matches that Bruno actually had in 1986 that are really worth mentioning, including quite a few of them inside the steel cage. And that's a perfect segue into the steel cage match. Today, it's just kind of taken for granted. But LL, I'm going to have you jump in here and talk about, some of your memories growing up watching these steel cage matches. Back in the day, the steel cage was the king of stipulations.
Yeah, it was. It was the steel cage back then was used as a weapon. You couldn't climb out. You had a pin or submit. You had to pin or submit your opponent. It was rough and ready. There was color. There was blood. You would throw somebody into the fence. You would use their face and just rub it against the fence. There was so much that it was then that now it's more of a joke. You could climb on top. You could climb over. They don't use it the way they should. It's just there. It was a special match. You looked forward to seeing it.
Yeah. My memories is that the cage match was the ultimate blow-off match to most feuds. They would be locked in there, and like she said, you had to pin or submit your opponent. There was no escaping the cage to win. If you escaped the cage, you were disqualified. The match was immediately given to the person in the ring. If you tried to escape the cage, i.e. what they tried to do with War Games, NXT War Games.
Yeah.
That's the same thing they did. That's the way it was back in the old days, is that if you climbed out of the cage, the match was immediately given to the person that was still in the cage. And yes, the cage was used as a weapon. You look at the infamous, the famous leap in Madison Square Garden. Jimmy Superfly Snuka onto the Magnificent Morocco. Snuka was bloody.
Oh, yeah.
Morocco was bloody. Anytime there was a cage match, both competitors, I say competitors, I'm not going to say performers, but competitors bled. Because it was made, like she said, you throw them into the fence or into the chain. It was chain link fence. You threw them into the fence, they would come up bleeding. It made it real to everybody at ringside. Today, you see it, you throw them face first into the cage. You look at what prime example, the greatest Royal Rumble. Roman Reigns threw Brock Lesnar into the cage 5 times in a row. And nothing happened to him. No blood, nothing. Pete, ladies and gentlemen, that's not real.
Well, I want to pivot off of something here too, and it's on the cage stipulations. Ask you a question. When did you first start seeing the escape the cage rule kind of take over? Now, in the NWA and in the AWA, the classic rules of the cage match were kind of uniform most throughout the history of the promotions. It was always pinfall or submission. The cage was there to keep people out. WWF kind of had the escape the cage rule that's really in place from early on. When did you see that stipulation start to pick up steam? And did that stipulation diminish the value of the cage match to you? Or was it just kind of a quirk that didn't really matter one way or the other?
It was something to me that minimized the stipulation because the cage did 2 things, not just the one of keeping people out. The cage was also designed to keep people in. Because
Right.
the heel was always the one that would run and take the 10 count, i.e. what Alexa Bliss was doing at times. She'd just pick up her belt and walk off, take the 10 count, take the count out loss. And that's what the heels were doing. So to keep them from doing that, they'd put the cage up around the ring so you can't leave. The escape the cage thing, I think, was an exclusive WWE thing, or WWF at the time, and it made the cage less important. And over time, as the company changed from WWF to WWE, they've gone back to now you can win 3 ways in a cage match: escape the cage, pinfall, or submission. Now, and that to me is a good thing. But they need to eliminate the escape the cage. It should be strictly pinfall submission. And they need to make the cage have its mystique once again. I.e., you throw someone into it, they bleed. But in today's times of the bloodborne pathogens that are out there, the Hep C's, HIV, and other things, I can see the reason why they don't. But there's, I've advocated for this for years. Test everyone. If you're going to put them in a cage, get them tested. If they don't have it, let them bleed. It doesn't have to be every match or every match leading up to it. I mean, we saw Roman get hard weighed by Brock at WrestleMania. You were there, so you saw it.
Oh, I saw it. Yeah, that was kind of everybody
It was kind of gruesome.
Step back and like, whoa. Yeah, it was bloody. It was gruesome, but it added to the beating, which that match, there was a lot of backlash from the crowd during that match, but that was one of the few moments where the crowd did kind of get into it a little bit. Now, that whatever that says about their interest in Roman Reigns, make your own conclusions, but blood, when used sparingly and when used appropriately, can definitely add to the presentation. We've seen that throughout the history of wrestling. Now, you can go too far the other direction. Your classic ECW, some of the Japanese death matches from the IWA. Mid-Atlantic wrestling, especially under Dusty Rhodes, was really bad about having just everybody bleed all the time. I think you watch Starrcade 83, within the first 2 matches, there's people bleeding. Referees would get busted open. So you could go too far with it. But, Ella, let's get you to jump in here. Talk a little bit about this.
That's like the AWA used to see blood all the time. But it's the way the matches were. It worked. When I started seeing cage matches, it seemed like for WWF, the stipulation for escaping seemed to move more in the 90s. That came out. But the cage wasn't used for special occasions. It seemed to be used more and more and more.
Yeah, the cage became a run of the mill, and then God,
That's special.
yeah, and God, the one cage I never liked that WWF used was the jail cell type bars,
The big blue bars.
the big blue bars. I never liked that cage.
Only in because the people that were wrestling in the company at that time were not athletic enough to climb up and out over the old mesh cage.
Whatever.
Well, we've been talking about cage matches, and you can tell the passion that y'all have for it because cage matches used to be special. And
They're not anymore.
They're not. But if you have a subscription to the WWE Network, I want to point you to 2 matches. Now, lucky for you, they're in the exact same place. If you go into the vault, WWE released a bunch of their old Coliseum video tapes onto the network, and one of them is inside the steel cage. Now, I have to throw this in here, and you can draw your own conclusions about what this says about me. This used to be my very favorite wrestling tape.
You bloodthirsty fool, you.
Every year on my birthday, I am not kidding you. Ryan Sayo can verify this. He has firsthand knowledge. Every year on my birthday, for about 12 to 13 years, this is when this tape disappeared and I could no longer rent it. My birthday routine was the exact same thing. It was dinner at the Mexican restaurant right beside Blockbuster, and then we would go over to Blockbuster and I would get to rent inside the steel cage. It was the only time of the year that I got to rent this tape.
You're a
and for about 13
fool, aren't you?
solid years, I was a maniac for this tape. But for 13 straight years, I rented this tape. And so I've seen these matches about 15,000 times. There's 2 matches on here. There's actually 3 Bruno matches that you can find. One of them is from the ye olden days of MSG back in the 60s when he was wrestling George the Animal Steel in a steel cage and filmed on what looked like an 8mm Zapruder film style camera. But there are 2 matches that I want to point your attention to. And the first is one that we're going to talk about here right now. From February of 1986, Bruno Sammartino had kind of a mini feud going with another legend of the business, Roddy Piper. Now, we've talked some about Roddy in the past, but not nearly as much as we would want to. Bruno and Roddy had kind of this feud going, and y'all can weigh in on this a little bit from your own personal experience watching Roddy during this era. Roddy was a jerk, and he had an innate ability to piss people off. And one of the great things about late era Bruno, and you'll see this both cage matches that we're going to talk about here, Bruno had a certain ability to just kick copious amounts of ass. Bruno, especially in the later part of his career, really kind of fell into a brawling gimmick. He was just a tough old man that would beat the snot out of you. Mm-hmm. And Roddy was so good at making people hate him in this era. He was actually kind of Taker, don't kill me. I already tell that you're going to reach through and try to strangle me when I say this. Just hear me out. Mm. Roddy was kind of an early version of The Miz.
How come I knew you were going to go there?
Let me explain.
I don't have a problem with the comparison because it's true.
Okay. Just as long as you understand that I'm not demeaning.
The other way around. It's The Miz is taking a page out of Roddy's book.
Well, yes, the Miz is copying Roddy. Now, Roddy was a more accomplished wrestler than the Miz was. You didn't get to see it much in the WWF, but he was also a Golden Gloves champion. He had a boxing background in Roddy Piper, and he had some amateur wrestling skills. You saw it a little bit more when he was wrestling in Portland. In Los Angeles, we mentioned the LA promotion. He was out in California for a while. By the time he got to the WWF, he wasn't quite the same worker in the ring, but he could talk. My God, he could talk. Roddy had such an ability to make people hate him. He turned himself babyface, which, if you really think about it, that's quite the accomplishment considering he had spent the past year and a half feuding with Hulk Hogan, who was the most popular wrestler on the planet. So to go from the most hated heel in the company to one of its most beloved baby faces in the span of a year, it's quite a feat. Okay,
But the thing about that whole, on that what you're talking about there, it was not something the company did. It was not something the company tried to force.
right.
It was organic.
Organic. Ding,
And
ding, ding.
this is the problem with the product today. The company is not the one who makes the person a heel or a face. They may debut such a group or a person as a heel, but even today, the work that they do in the ring is what, and I'm not saying work rate. I'm saying the ability to, to work, to tell a story while in the ring, listening to the crowd. One of the greatest people that ever did it, of calling a match on the fly with anybody, was Ric Flair.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll give, Ric Flair and Jerry Lawler, for that matter. Those two were our masters at calling a match on the fly. All they needed to set up before they went into the ring with you was the finish. The rest they did on the fly in the ring. Because they would listen to what the crowd is doing. And that's something Roddy Piper could do. He could tell a story and get the person he's working with over. And, have the crowd in the palm of his hand to the point that when the face, when Roddy was a heel, the face would win, babies would be thrown into the air. That's how good he was as a heel.
Yeah, he's in full-on heel mode in this cage match from '86, and Bruno was just the man to put him in his place. But Roddy, so many great lines. There's too many to even count, and we'll talk more about Roddy in a later episode. Obviously, we got to get to Roddy Piper.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, in this particular match, he's posting up posters of the Chicago Bears in the cage. Chicago Bears had won the Super Bowl that year, an event which, Taker, I'm sure you and LL remember.
I remember it because
quite vividly.
I remember it because I am a diehard Bears fan.
So you were definitely remembering the '85 Bears, and Roddy here is putting up posters of the '85 Bears inside the steel cage. For reference, Taker, you know this, of course. The Bears beat the New England Patriots in the Super Bowl, and Roddy is doing this in Boston. So you can imagine how badly the crowd wanted to see Bruno kick Roddy's ass. And that's exactly what happened. Within the first 90 seconds of the match, Roddy looks like he's tapped an oil well in his head. He's just spurting blood everywhere. He's a bloody mess. Go find that match on the network. It's inside the steel cage. It's in the vault. And you can also find another match, a tag team cage match. Now, this was particularly rare. You didn't see too many of these in the WWF during this period. Of course, we've talked in the past about a pretty famous cage match involving multiple people on this show that you'll remember if you're an avid listener of the Connoisseurs of Wrestling, and shame on you if you're not. That's a hint to go watch some of our old episodes, or go listen, rather. But there's another tag team cage match on this Coliseum video on the network that you need to check out. It's Randy Macho Man Savage and adorable Adrian Adonis taking on the tag team of Tito Santana and Bruno Sammartino. And LL, I want you to jump in here. Adrian Adonis, I know that he spent a little bit of time in the AWA wrestling with Jesse Ventura. Do you have any memories of Adrian Adonis? He's someone that a lot of modern fans may not remember, but he was a hell of a worker in his age.
I remember him very little. So I can't give much. Jesse, I know more about, but Adrian Adonis, I really don't know much about him. But I do know he was a good friend of Roddy Piper's. So I can't give you much there. Sorry.
That's okay.
She tries. But no, yeah, that's one thing she does make a statement of, is that, Adrian Adonis was the best friend of Roddy. And that's a known fact. Roddy has stated that more than once. And I'm going to segue here a little bit. There is a video on YouTube called The Haunting. And it's the haunting of Roddy Piper. I'm not going to get into details, but go ahead, ladies and gentlemen, search it out on YouTube. You might be surprised at what you find out. Because there's some freaky shit that goes on.
Well, that might be a big explanation why Roddy's last major angle before he retired for the first time was with Adrian Adonis, because they were such good friends.
Well, you know as well as I do, who would you trust the most in ring with you? We can go back and look at the history of it. Piper and Steamboat, great friends.
Mm-hmm.
Or no, Flair and Steamboat, great friends.
Right.
Piper and Adonis, great friends. Triple H and Shawn Michaels, great friends. You look at those matches. You look at those three pairs. Look at the matches they put on, especially after Shawn came back. The matches he put on with Triple H. For a solid year and a half, they beat the tar out of one another. Why? Because there was actually some underlying issues between the two of them that got sorted out in the ring. But those two today are still best friends.
Yeah. There's a certain innate ability for people that have a relationship outside of the business to really put on some great matches. I think it's the natural chemistry that friends have between them kind of bleeds into the wrestling aspect. Flair and Piper were good friends, and they had some great chemistry. Bruno Sammartino and Superstar Billy Graham were friends for a time. They had some great chemistry in the 70s.
Yep.
Both of them were definitely of that power wrestler mold. Of course, Billy Graham, pretty influential in his own right, inspiring a lot of wrestlers from the 80s and 90s. But that innate chemistry in the ring, and Adonis and Savage, they weren't a regular tag team in 86. Randy Savage, by this point, was the Intercontinental Champion. He had beaten Tito Santana once again in the Boston Garden, actually. The cage match that we're talking about took place at Madison Square Garden in July of 86. But that February, he had beaten Tito for the Intercontinental title. So Randy Savage was already at this point established as a guy on the way up. Adrian Adonis was a very controversial wrestler. And if you know a little bit about his character during this point, you'll understand why. Adrian Adonis was not the first wrestler to really be given this gimmick. I think, he's even predated in the 80s by Exotic Adrian Street.
Oh, God, yes.
But one of the characterizations of Adonis, when he first came to the WWF from the AWA, he was a New York street tough. He was almost like a kind of an 80s version of Taz in the sense he was from Brooklyn. He was from the streets. He was rough. He was tough. He had a leather jacket. He wore a dog collar around his neck to the ring. He was just kind of that tough brawler, but he was a great worker. But he had a problem. One of his problems was he had a weight issue. He gained a lot of weight over 85. He was tagged team partners in the WWF with the late Dick Murdoch of the Texas Outlaws fame. Of course, Dick Murdoch, a legend in his own right. They had a tag team in the WWF for a while. But the weight gain kind of put an end to that, and he was punished by Vince McMahon with a gimmick where he was essentially the first semi-openly gay wrestler in the WWF. And
Right.
It was not done with any tact. Of course, you can imagine in this era, in the 80s, this was, done way over the top. He started wearing dresses. He started putting makeup on his face, putting bow ties in his hair. To his credit, he played it to a hilt. I mean, he just went full in on the character. A very negative, a very unfortunate stereotype now. But don't let the stereotype of the character diminish the quality of the match or what Adrian Adonis brought to the ring as a worker. Even though he was a bigger man in 86, he was still one hell of a wrestler, and it's a shame that he passed away in the car wreck a year later after he had left the WWF, because he had gotten back into shape and he was kind of making a comeback when he passed away. But this tag match is exceptionally good. Randy and Adrian Adonis had some really good chemistry. Tito and Bruno, two quintessential babyface heroes, just going out. It's mayhem. It's Texas Tornado rules. These guys are just beating the crap out of each other. Randy Savage does a 5-alarm blade job in the match. He looks like he taps an artery. You know, it's just glorious fun. Gorilla Monsoon and Lord Alfred Hayes are on commentary. Great pairing, actually. Lord Alfred Hayes gets shit on a lot. He's actually quite a good partner for Gorilla on commentary. I'll forever defend Lord Alfred, or Awful Alfred, as he was called by Hulk Hogan during the era. But, you know, there's some great tag team wrestling there featuring 4 of the best workers in the business at that time.
Right. Well, you're saying Lord Alfred Hayes. LL's name for him is what?
Lord Al Finkel.
Lord Al Finkel. That's what she called him.
But I'm not the only one. You would have the Crusher. You'd have a lot of people would call him Lord Al Finkel.
Because Lord Alfred was a heel in the AWA.
Yep.
He was not the friendly babyface that he would become in the WWF. I didn't think about that for a second there. And then Alfred gets crapped on a lot. I will forever defend him because he brought a little bit of class and sophistication to Tuesday Night Titans. And it was really fun watching Andre palm his face with his hand like he used to with Gene Okerlund. And Alfred had the greatest expression. He looked mortified, like he had just been forced to sit through the Twilight Saga nonstop.
Yeah.
But it was great stuff. I'm a big Alfred fan.
Hey, the Twilight Saga is a very good saga.
And that's the end of the Connoisseurs of Wrestling, folks. I'm retiring on that one. Sweet baby Jesus, we have.
She liked the Twilight series. You have to, you know.
Well,
I accept it. I've watched it. And it's like it's okay.
I'm divorced. I don't have to accept nothing. I'm off of my chain. I can say whatever the hell I want. But
that has nothing to do with the fact that we're married. You know, it's not something I'm big into, and she knows it. But you know,
well, you're lucky because it was definitely something I was stuck with.
Let's put it this way, and then we'll get back to what we're talking about. The books, because we have the books on audio. The books are better than the movie. Any book that someone tries to adapt to a movie, so much is left out. I mean, if you see the movie, one of the classics, Tom Clancy, one of the greatest writers, you know, that has to do with military, politics, whatever. Some of the greatest fiction he wrote was the Jack Ryan series.
Yeah.
Read the book, The Hunt for Red October, and then watch the movie.
Oh, no contest.
It's completely different.
The movie is completely different from the book.
And I do like the movie, by the way, but the book is infinitely better. Red Storm Rising is another great one.
Oh God, that is man. Well, my all-time favorite is The Bear and the Dragon.
Oh, we got to be careful. We're about to go off the reservation here.
Yes, because me and him know that complete series by heart.
We're going to have a non-wrestling episode of the Connoisseurs and talk about some fancy novels.
All I can say is this. I actually took the time, and ladies and gentlemen, when I listened to the Tom Clancy series, I actually took the time to put the books in order of chronological order. Because the way they were released, Hunt for Red October was first. But if you listen to the story, they're all connected to a point. Each book is connected to the other one. And I put them in chronological order, and that's how I listen to them. And it's one continuous story if you look at it.
You know, the thing is I got him into this story because I've read about 3/4 of the books before we even met.
Well, I would say that it's better to get into Clancy than Stephanie Meyer, but that's just my personal opinion. I'm not qualitatively saying that as fact. Not now anyway, but be that as it may, you know, we good Lord. You know, I mean, they are some very good books, but these are some very good cage matches that we're talking about too.
Yes.
I'll get us back on the reservation here, guys. Don't you worry. But no,
That's all right.
if you have a network subscription, I want you to go find these cage matches because they are, you know, the best WWF style cage matches that you would really find during this era. Now that entire video, it's got some really great stuff on there. It's got a nice match with Bob Backlund and Pat Patterson from, I believe, 1979 on there. It's also an excellent match. Andre has his famous butt splash off the top rope that nearly killed John Studd. That's good for a laugh. He does the same thing to Kamala, but he protected Kamala a little bit more. But go find those two Bruno matches on there, and you can watch the George Steele match if you want to as well.
Now this is George Steele, you say from the '60s, before he was the goofy guy that would go in there and eat turnbuckles and.
Yeah, maybe that would be a good chance to talk about some of the Bruno matches from the '60s I have on the list here. I got an entire list of Bruno matches. He had a match with George Steele. Now you just brought it up, and I'm going to get you to elaborate on it a little bit here. George Steele in the '80s, a lot of people's memories are the goofy guy that ate the turnbuckles. That was kind of almost the wrestling mascot for WWF during the mid
green
'80s.
tongue, the one that was stacking Miss Elizabeth, he was so in love with.
Yes, and Bruno is involved in that angle too, which we can dovetail back to that in the end as well. But yeah, George Steele from the '80s versus George Steele from the '60s and '70s, it's night and day. Can you talk a little bit about George Steele and kind of who he used to be before he kind of turned into a joke wrestler?
Well, he was a heel, plain and simple. And he was he had the reputation of being rather stiff. And he was the quintessential Roddy Piper of his time. He actually could talk. He's a very, very intelligent man. Mathematics genius. Taught college for that matter. You know, and people say, what? That guy, yeah. That goofy oddball from the 80s and 90s actually is a genius. That's why he was so good at his character work. He knew what worked. Even as a heel, he was the heelest of heels. His move that he used, his finishing move, which he used, was banned because he did actually hurt someone with it. And that was the flying hammerlock. Now, what that is, ladies and gentlemen, is you take and put someone into the hammerlock, which is their one arm behind their back, and he would literally lift them up off the ring, off the mat, and hold them up in the air. And
sounds like a torn rotator cuff. Oof.
No, he tore an elbow apart.
Oh,
most of the pressure is on an elbow. He ripped the guy's ligaments out of his elbow, and it was an accident, but he had to pay the price. Hence the repackaging as the goofball. But he made it his own and it worked.
He did. And he was a memorable character. I'm not diminishing the comedy run that he had because he was a popular character in the 80s. If you watch the Bruno
as the guy who went in there and destroyed turnbuckles and stuff like that, turnbuckle pads, I should say, he still was not liked. It wasn't until he got aligned with Steamboat and the whole Miss Elizabeth thing. Steamboat, Savage, you know, the whole thing with Elizabeth was Savage was the heel.
Yes,
and that's what started his turn to babyface.
Right, and you know, Bruno Sammartino factors into this angle too. We'll talk about here for a little bit. Bruno at the time was, as we mentioned earlier, he was commentating on Superstars. Everybody, I think, has at least heard, if not seen. If you've never seen Randy Savage versus Ricky Steamboat from WrestleMania 3, after we're done, stop what you're doing and go watch that match. That match has to be seen. Okay, I'm just that's a commandment of wrestling. That's the 11th commandment. God commands you to watch WrestleMania 3.
Thou shalt go watch WrestleMania 3 Steamboat Savage.
Yes, that's
I use that match, and I am on public record for saying this. I use that match as the yardstick of all matches at any WrestleMania, any match, because that was a match that wasn't made a big deal. They didn't really promote it much. It was there. But Steamboat and Savage stole the show that night.
Oh, it became a big deal after the fact.
Yeah.
That match was a legendary match. That match is better than most anything you're going to see on pay-per-view this year. There's only a handful of matches that are even in the ballpark. I'm not making that up. It is that good. Even by today's standards, the match would be an all-time classic. So
I believe there were 25 to 30 false finishes in the 23.5 minutes they had.
Yeah, and if you ever watch, and it's not so prevalent today, if you watch Kurt Angle and Chris Benoit or Chris Jericho in the early 2000s, whenever you see matches where they'll do, and Rob Van Dam and Jerry Lynn lifted this in ECW in the 90s too, all the rapid fire pins where they'll like do the roll ups and the double leg hooks and the cradles and everything, that was picked up from Randy Savage and Ricky Steamboat at WrestleMania 3.
Yep.
There's a series of spots in the match where Ricky Steamboat is just doing everything in his power to pin Randy Savage, and it leads to the all-time great Gorilla Monsoon line. What a battle. Okay, that just gives you an indication of how good that match was. But the reason I bring up Savage and Steamboat is Bruno Sammartino got tied into this. Randy Savage, in order to set up the angle, was wrestling against Steamboat on an episode of Superstars, and he used the ring bell and also the guardrail outside. They used to have the old police metal barricades to crush Steamboat's larynx, crushed his throat, and did an injury angle where Steamboat kind of left for a while and was off TV.
Yeah, he was actually injured, but
yeah, they kind of used it as a chance to kind of get him off TV for a little bit. Randy Savage became this killer heel, this monstrous guy that, almost killed Ricky Steamboat, who was the babyface of babyfaces. And Savage, after the fact, went backstage, and Bruno Sammartino, who was commentating on Superstars, went backstage to get an update on Ricky Steamboat's condition because they were going to take him to the hospital as part of the angle. And this is on YouTube. You can search out Bruno Sammartino and Randy Savage. Randy Savage comes into the locker room area where Bruno is standing giving the report on Ricky Steamboat, and Savage is gloating about the fact that he had hurt Ricky Steamboat with the ring bell. Bruno gets so incensed by this that he proceeds to kick in some unholy levels of ass on Randy Savage. As a commentator, he's in his WWF blazer. They used to have the red jacket that they used to wear. And Bruno just starts choking Randy Savage, and all the wrestlers have to converge. It's a great angle, a tremendous angle. Get on YouTube. You can find the Randy Savage, Bruno Sammartino matches that they had in early 87 for the Intercontinental title. It's one of the only times that Bruno ever challenged for that particular title. But there is some great stuff with Bruno and Randy that kind of dovetails into the Ricky Steamboat angle. We were talking George Steele. He was, with Ricky Steamboat during this period. And this ties into the feud that Randy and George had. See, this is what's so great about wrestling. My God, I'm just sitting here rattling off all of these angles that tied into each other. It was organic. It flowed one to the other. You had all of these programs that just kind of converge at WrestleMania 3, and Bruno fits right in there. And so definitely go on YouTube, find those angles, find the angle where he starts choking out. Bruno very nearly cursed. Bruno never cursed, okay? Bruno's like one of the cleanest talking guys you'll ever hear, but he had to restrain himself from calling Randy a piece of garbage. And
we had to restrain from calling Randy a MF son of a bitch.
Yeah, there you go. He almost called him a piece of shit. Okay, he called him you slime, you, and then he just dive tackles him. So it's great. Go find that. But that was really, one of the most memorable angles of his second run in the company was with Randy Savage. They wrestled quite a few matches in the 87. And I think they may have had a few matches after WrestleMania, but as you got further into 87, Bruno was kind of winding down his second run. which is where we want to kind of close out the story here, because Bruno Sammartino, Taker, you know this, LL, I'm sure you know this too. Bruno had a very public falling out with Vince McMahon Jr., our Vince McMahon that we know today. Had a very public falling out, and outside of a few appearances for the NWA, he was at Halloween Havoc 89 as a special referee for the main event in Philadelphia, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
He also had a few shots on TBS, but other than that, once you get past 1988, Bruno Sammartino just kind of disappears from the business. A self-imposed exile because he could not stand the direction of the business. Now, LL, I want to bring you into the conversation here because I know you have an opinion on this. Bruno could not accept the changes that the business were undergoing. As a fan of wrestling, as a fan, particularly during this era, did you agree with Bruno's assessment that wrestling had gone too far, or did you think that, yes, wrestling has changed, but it's changed for the better? You know, what was your opinion on the falling out with Bruno? Do you think he had a reason to leave, or do you think it was a mistake for him to take so much time away?
I think he had a reason to leave because he came in at a time when wrestling was a sport. And it became too much of a joke. It wasn't a sport anymore. And some people can take the change and some can't.
Yeah, Bruno had a problem with the way it was going with the rampant use of steroids back then in the locker room. And he considered some of the storylines that they were doing to be vulgar. You know, one thing you could say about Bruno is he had principles. And he stuck to his principles. That was the key of him. He would stick to his beliefs. You know, he was very much a God-fearing Catholic.
Met the Pope at one point, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, he did. He had an audience with the Pope. Him, his mother, and his father before they passed. And hell, his entire family had a meeting with the Pope. And this is a man that, you know, he had principles. And
the use of women, the way the WWF used women, he did not like. He had too much respect for the women, for them to be used that way. He had too much respect for a lot of the wrestlers to be used the way they were used.
this goes back to like what I said when we were first talking about him, when he was top man. He felt it was his job to get the preliminary guys and the undercard guys more money. And he did that. You know, he was always thinking of everyone else, not himself. And that's where I think the vulgar part came about, is because he felt that what Vince was doing was getting away from what the sport of wrestling and getting more into the entertainment aspect of wrestling. Because he did, and I understand the reasons behind it. Okay. As a sport, he was governed by all the state athletic commissions. Had to have a doctor ringside, had to have, you know, all this stuff. Change it over to sports entertainment, he's not required to have that, because the state athletic commission, you're not a sport? Okay, you decertified yourself as a sport? Well, then that's fine. And that's what's given us what we've got today.
It is definitely one of the biggest transitions in this period from what wrestling used to be in the territorial era to kind of the forerunner to what we have today. By the time Bruno leaves in '88, the WWF has really established itself as the #1 promotion in the country, and it's about to go global with its influence. The NWA is kind of on its last legs as an entity. Crockett is about to be sold by the Crockett family to Ted Turner, who out of that promotion will form what becomes WCW, and that sets the stage for the 90s. So really, Bruno, leaves the business kind of at the very end of what we would consider to be the territorial era. Yeah.
I call it the golden era.
I do too. I tend to agree with you on that one because I don't think wrestling has ever quite recovered from that. It certainly didn't recover what Crockett used to be, but I'll talk about that later. That's another episode, soapbox.
But you think of it too, when you lost the territories, you lost the sport.
Yes.
And that's the problem. There wasn't a sport anymore. It was more entertainment. And for Bruno was too much of a sportsman. He loved his sport. He was too much of a sportsman to be in something he couldn't believe in.
That's it. That's it in a nutshell with Bruno.
Yeah, it's just, it was a bridge too far for him, and he wasn't the only one that couldn't handle the change. And, we're not going to judge him for leaving. He had his principles. I think it's, he's a very moral man. He's a good man. And he had reasons for leaving that were legitimate. And as longtime fans, I think all three of us here can agree that there was some merit to what he had to argue. And, you see what wrestling has become. I'm very thankful that Bruno came back at the end of his life over the last couple of years to be honored, because he deserved to be honored. His legacy is secure, even though he spent so much time away from the business. He was wrestling's greatest champion during his era. No other champion held a title like he did during the 60s and 70s. You didn't see it in the AWA. You didn't see it in the NWA. You had some of the greatest champions in terms of in-ring quality in those companies. You had Vern Gagne, Nick Bockwinkel from the AWA, the Briscoes, you had the Funks, Harley Race in the NWA, Flair, But in terms of longevity and in terms of, box office drawing power in the Northeast, Bruno owned New York for a long time.
Bruno owned the Northeast, period.
Yeah, and he really set the table for everything that's come after him. Without Bruno, there's no Hulk Hogan, there's no Bret Hart, there's no Shawn Michaels, there's no Rock or Austin, there's no Monday Night Wars. There's no Cena, there's no Batista, there's no Punk, no Bryan, no Shield, no nothing.
Nope.
Bruno built that company, and he solidified its existence. And, you look at all the stars. I posted this on Cateside Seats with our show info today. There is a very short list of men that you could look at and say, yes, they were the faces of the company, where they're some of the most important people, the heart and soul. It's a very short list. And Bruno, for my money, is on the top of that list. He's in that pantheon with your Andre the Giants, your Undertakers, your Austins, your Hogans. He is in that mix, because without Bruno, there is no company as you know it today. And for that reason alone, you can't undersell what he brought to the company, even if he was gone for so many years. And we went so long. There's so many people in the last 2 or 3 generations that never got to experience Bruno Sammartino and what he could do. Now that he's gone, I think it's important that we remember, his legacy, even with his absence, even with the falling out he had with Vince. And it was a serious falling out. They went on talk shows, Larry King Live, the Phil Donahue Show, and they were just going at each other.
And Geraldo, for that matter.
Yeah, it was a very, very nasty public split between them. Bruno did not pull punches. Okay, this is, even CM Punk didn't leave on such bad terms.
No.
At least CM Punk, blasted the company on the podcast. Bruno Sammartino went on national TV and did it.
Yeah.
So, it was a nasty, acrimonious split, but despite the way it ended, Bruno's legacy is secure, and I'm thankful for that as a fan of Bruno's and as a fan of the WWF in general during that period. He meant a lot to the company and to the fans. And if you grew up watching him, or if you're like us and you kind of came by him after the fact or, through secondary sources, however you experience Bruno, Bruno is unique. Bruno is Bruno. And
Oh,
it's well worth finding Bruno's work because he is a very unique part of wrestling history. And that's what we want to bring out here on the Connoisseurs of Wrestling.
yeah.
So.
Bruno, like I stated before, in the very first, on the first part of Bruno is the foundation of what WWF was, or WWF was, WWF, and WWE. Even now that he's gone, he still has the weight of what the company is on his shoulders. He is holding up everything that is today.
He's holding up wrestling, period, as a sport, showing what a wrestler really was.
Exactly.
You can't undersell it.
Like you said, there would be no Hulk Hogan. There would be no Undertaker. There would be no Rock or Austin or Daniel Bryan or CM Punk or any of the big stars today if it not for Bruno.
He was a man's man in an era of men, and he brought integrity to his craft. He brought a certain charm and charisma that was not matched in his era. Bruno is and will always be wrestling's greatest champion in my eyes. And he is, undoubtedly one of the most important figures that we could talk about on the show, especially in terms of wrestling in the Northeast and what the WWE has become today.
Well, his first run of as champion lasted, what, 8.5 years?
Yeah, almost a decade of dominance.
Okay,
which is unheard of.
Which is unheard of in today's times.
Oh yeah, yeah. Imagine if Roman Reigns held the title for 8 years. I mean, imagine the firestorm online if that were to happen today.
Imagine a firestorm if Alexa Bliss held the women's title for 8 years.
Oh,
and you look at Moolah. Moolah held the women's championship for how many years?
It was claimed like 30, but she wasn't like actively defending it the whole time. It's kind of complex. That's a really weird story that we touched on that we'll need to go a full episode on one day. Trying to unravel the mystery that is Fabulous Moolah. But I mean, it's just crazy. It's just really crazy.
Lillian.
Oh Lord.
That's her shoot name. That's her shoot first name. I can't pull her last name off the top of my head, but her first name was Lillian.
Lillian Ellison. Fabulous Moolah. So on that note, unfortunately, we are closing in on running out of time here this week.
We got time. I got another 25.
You do. I have a quiz that I have to take here for grad school.
Oh.
Yeah, yours truly is in his summer semester of grad school, and he's getting his ass kicked right now. So your thoughts, everybody, my way. I'm going to need them. But before we do sign off, got a few housekeeping notes to take up. But first of all, let's get our plugs out of the way. We have a couple of shows that we like to keep track of. Of course, we'd be remiss without mentioning the greatest of the shows, the Shooting the Breeze podcast that drops Saturday morning with Taker's Minion and Doc Senju, 11 a.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Eastern on the weekends of the big pay-per-views. Will that be this case for Money in the Bank? Will you be going an hour early for that?
No, we do not consider that one of the big. Even though WWE is doing it, we stick to the Rumble, Royal Rumble, WrestleMania, SummerSlam, Survivor Series.
Okay.
We call that the Big Four.
Yeah, the Big Four, and we'll need to have an episode talking about the Big Four at some point and explain why it used to be the Big Four. But the Shooting the Breeze podcast, catch that Saturday mornings, 11 a.m. Eastern on YouTube. It's live every week, and it's well worth your time. It's the best podcast going today. My podcast, the Queen City Express, was off this week, and it was accidental. I spent too much time watching sumo. And
which our guy did not win the championship, but
he made the Ozeki run that he needed to make.
Yes, he did.
So Touch an Ocean, he came in second in the Basho.
Junju show, yes.
It was a great performance. He came very close to winning. He had an excellent tournament. So congratulations to him. Go ahead and bust out some congratulations while we're at it. Of course, it's been a big racing day. Daniel Ricciardo won Grand Prix in Monaco. Congratulations to him. Will Power got his first Indy 500. Looks like Kyle Busch is on pace to get his first Coca-Cola 600 right now. They've got about 45 laps to go. And Cleveland is up on Boston in the Game 7 of the Eastern Conference Finals. So big sporting day. The Queen City Express will be back next week to its regular scheduled time. I'll be back on a regular sleeping schedule, so I won't sleep through it again.
Ladies and gentlemen, blame me for that because I'm the one that got Biff Kensington III into sumo. I should say back into sumo.
Yeah, you got that addiction back going again, so I blame you on that one.
It's a nice diversion from WWE.
Yes, we really need to have a full-on episode about sumo in the future because it is wrestling.
Oh Jesus, that'll take several episodes because we got over 1,500 years of history to talk about.
That'll be its own side series, like the PBS version of the Connoisseurs of Wrestling. Lay that out. There's so many shows, of course, all of the podcasts associated with.
We've got other ones that we got 2 guys, 1 sport. That's with Crazy Chris Colgan and George Curtin Jerker at Sabes. They drop on Thursdays at 8 or 9 Eastern, 8 Central. Give those guys a listen. They've been on hiatus. They should be back this week, if I'm not mistaken.
I believe you're right. I believe they are back this week.
They took a hiatus for the month of May. I spoke with Chris earlier this morning because he was streaming somewhere. And I believe he said they were coming back this week. He has kept in the loop. He's listened to both this show and to mine. We cannot forget the Ruthless Aggression podcast with Metal Matt.
Yes, that's also going to be coming back. I'm actually going to be making a guest appearance on that show next week, I believe it is.
Good for you.
Have to clarify on that one. I'll double check on the date, but I'll be back on that show with Metal Matt here coming up.
And then there's Match Fixing with Don Sal Cusimano. That's over on Cedar Bridge Media. He's a good guy. Give him a listen. And you got Fitzpatrick 14 or 14 Fitzpatrick on Cage-Side Seats. He's in his series 2, he calls it, Fizzy's Wacky World of Wrestling. He's been on a bit of a hiatus himself due to allergy issues and just life in general. He should be back here the next week or 2. And we got the Violent Wrestling podcast with Prince Moxley Lopez and Ambrose Alley. That drops whenever they have the time to do one. They don't have a set schedule.
Mox is my baby daddy. If you're from Cage-Side Seats, you'll know all about that. So
too much information. TMI.
Don't forget to check out the Cage-Side Seats daily and nightly threads too. There's all sorts of great discussion that goes on there. We like to plug it every week here.
Yep. You can find me, of course, on Twitter at takers_minion. You can also find me in a not so much recently in the daily, but in the nightly, pretty much every night because I work 3rd shifts. Where can they find you, Legend Lover?
Windstorm64 at Twitter. Sorry, my voice is gone.
That is perfectly okay. We got all the contact information down in our info box. You can catch us on Twitter. You can find me at Biff Kensington, at Real Deal Biff on Twitter, but we got the info in the info box. It's been a good show tonight. We're going to go ahead and close out here, but did want to make note we will be bringing you a very special episode next Sunday. It'll be the first episode of June. We have a real special program, a couple of special programs lined up for you in the month of June. We'll be talking more about that next week as we kind of kickstart things. Also got some interesting news coming to you about our own Hall of Fame, Connoisseurs of Wrestling.
Yeah, that we'll be enshrining another member this a week from tonight. We will be enshrining a new member.
Yep, and that's going to be a very special part of our episode next week. So if you get a chance, definitely be with us. Same time, same channel, 9 p.m. Eastern, Sunday evenings. Of course, you can stream it whenever on our YouTube channel. Be sure to drop us a line on Twitter. Catch us at Cage-Side Seats if you see us. We always love talking.
And don't forget, we've got our own email. Connoisseurs of Wrestling has its own email on Gmail. I believe it's a Gmail. It is
Connoisseurs
of Wrestling. And that's all one word at gmail.com. For any suggestions for possible show content, members to be put into the Hall of Fame, or to tell us what you think of our show in general, that is Connoisseurs of Wrestling, one word, at gmail.com.
And please direct all personal requests for my time to my personal email, which you can find elsewhere, ladies. I am off the market, but I can still talk to you on email a little bit. So. Guys, on that note, that's going to do it for this week's edition of the Connoisseurs of Wrestling. Thank you so very much for taking time out of your holiday weekend to talk some wrestling with us. For Legends Lover and Taker's Minion, I am Biff Kensington. You've been listening to the Connoisseurs of Wrestling. We'll see you next week. Have a good weekend, guys.
Happy Memorial Day, everyone.
Night.